Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Constitution, an online professional development seminar sponsored by the Osceola Teaching American History Project and the National Humanities Center. I'm Richard Schramm, the Vice President for Education Programs here at the Humanities Center, and I'll be moderating this evening's session. Before we get underway, I want to remind you of a few things. First of all, if you like these seminars, you might want to check out the seminars we offer for teachers across the United States. Our 2011-12 schedule is available at the Humanities Center's website. I urge you to check it out. We've got some really interesting seminars coming up for next fall. I think you'll enjoy them. I also want to point out to you our new teaching anthology, Making the Revolution. Some of the texts that we are going to be using this evening come from Making the Revolution. It contains nearly 150 items, either excerpted or in compilation. They include sermons, broadsides, poems, stories, maps, images. This is a very rich collection of material for teaching the American Revolution. So when you get around to that, I urge you to take a look at Making the Revolution. I think you'll find some useful material there. Now, I want to remind you also that the recording of this evening's seminar, along with the PowerPoint presentation, are available on the Constitution website that you use to obtain your text for the seminar. You'll also find on the website access to the evaluation form. Please fill that out and return it to us. It's very important. We pay attention to these evaluations, and so does your Teaching American History project. You can fill it out and submit it online. It'll take just a few minutes. Once we receive your evaluation, we will send you a documentation of participation that you'll be able to present to your local certifying authority to obtain whatever recertification credit your participation in this evening's seminar warrants. Are there any questions before we begin? If everybody's ready to go, send me a smiley face so I know that you're out there and you're all paying attention and you're ready to move ahead. There I see some coming up. Great. All right. So I guess we're all ready to go to study about the Constitution this evening. Well, our seminar has three goals. We want to deepen your understanding of the nation's transition from the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution. We want to help understand why our government is structured the way it is, and we would also like to provide you some fresh material for classroom instruction. Now, we are going to be looking at a series of questions this evening in our seminar. In what ways did the Articles represent the culmination of the Revolution's goals? Why did they not work for the nation? Who went to the Constitutional Convention, and why did they meet in secret once they decided to replace the Articles? Why were the delegates to the Constitutional Convention not optimistic about the future of the country? Why did they fear it would vanish? What role did the convention play in creating checks and balances, the bicameral legislature, separation of powers, an independent judiciary, and all the other things that characterize our government? What role did Anglo-American political culture play in the deliberations of the convention? What innovations in government did the convention develop? Why did the procedures for electing the president pose such a problem? What did the terms of the Electoral College reveal about the founders' fears of power and foreign influence? And finally, why did the convention fail to include a Bill of Rights? And what role did that failure play in ratification? All very important questions, all questions that come up in classes and that reverberate with us even today. To help us understand those questions and to work our way through them, we're very pleased to have with us Carol Birkin, who is the Presidential Professor of American Colonial History and Revolutionary History and Women's History at Baruch College, the City University of New York. She's written several books. Titles are there. The most recent one, Civil War Wives, The Life and Times of Angelina Grimke Weld, Verena Howell Davis, and Julia Dent Grant. Let me turn the program over to Carol right now. Okay, hello. Carol, it is all yours. So tell us, how did we come to have the Constitution we have?
Well, tonight I think I want to play the role of Mythbuster. I think about the way I learned about the Articles and the Constitution and the founding of the country. And it's a little bit like birth myths in every country. It's definitely heroic. Often God plays a hand in it. And we tend to see the men and women who participated in founding a country as larger than life. I want to talk a little bit about them as human beings, and I want to, don't worry, I don't not respect them. In fact, I respect them even more because of the fact that they really were, in many ways, ordinary men. I think we should start with one of our big myths, which is that the Articles of Confederation were weak. I always picture people in a gym, some guy who can't lift uh, 5-pound weights standing next to Arnold Schwarzenegger. Uh, the assumption is that they were put together somehow in the heat of battle and nobody knew what they were doing and they were just a terrible failure. So that's the first myth. How many of you have learned it that way? I mean, you saw up on the board, weak and strong. That's the sort of typical way we think about it.
Okay.
And it seems to me that we should think about the Articles of Confederation as the actual culmination of the goals of the revolution. They were battling against a distant tyrant who oppressed them, who didn't understand their needs, and so they create a government that has no executive branch at all. No executive branch, no chance for a tyrant. They thought that they were fighting a war for what they called no taxation without representation. And by that, they meant representation by men from their colony who they knew, who earned their living the same way they did, who they could hold accountable. They weren't thinking about a national government. They were thinking about their colonial government becoming an independent sovereign government. So if they formed any national government at all, they wanted one that didn't take away the powers of the states. And that's exactly what they got. So in many ways, the central government didn't have the power to tax because they were fighting against unfair taxation. They solved all the problems they saw from their colonial past by not creating a government that could ever impose these kinds of injustices on them. And so in many ways, it represents exactly what they were fighting for. The problem is, it's one thing to create a government that doesn't do what the old government did, but they couldn't manage, once the revolution was over, to really run a nation. So it isn't so much that the government was weak. It was really more that the government was restricted. And that's what men like George Washington and Alexander Hamilton were concerned about in the years after independence was won. So maybe this is a different sense about the Articles of Confederation than I certainly know I ever learned in school, and it probably is a little different from what you learned in school.
So, Carol, would you say that the perceived weakness, the weakness that we perceive and that we've been taught, was actually built into the Articles by the founders because they wanted a restricted government?
Absolutely. This wasn't a sort of accident. This wasn't, oh, gee, we're in the middle of a war, and so we really better slap something together. This was a document that did what these men thought they were fighting for. And they were sensible enough a few years later to say, wait a minute, this isn't working out really well. Washington calls the Confederation government a mere shadow. And that makes it clear that they realize that they don't really have a government that can manage a new nation. And if you all read that first chapter in A Brilliant Solution, which I immodestly assigned my own work, but if you read it, you saw all the things that were wrong. And the country really, from the point of view of most of the people who went to that constitutional convention, which of course they didn't call the Constitutional Convention, they called it a delegates convention, they really thought either foreign countries were going to invade them or that internally the new states would kill one another off. And they had pretty good reason to be worried about both of those things. I don't know about your students, but my students who were really high school seniors a few months later, They think that from the day Pilgrims landed, as one of my students said, on Plymouth Rock, from that day on, America was the most important country in the world. But the real truth is we were a third world nation. Europeans thought we were just ridiculous. They thought the United States wouldn't last 5 years. And they probably were right. They probably were correct. We couldn't pay our debts. We couldn't stop the pirates from taking our ships. We couldn't trade with the West Indies where we had once traded with British West Indies. We didn't have a navy. We couldn't move the Indians out of the West. We couldn't get the British out of the forts. And internally, the states that as colonies had never cooperated with one another went back to their old ways, and they put high tariffs on goods from one to the other. They had Virginia and Maryland had gunboats pointed at each other for fear that someone would try to smuggle something from one colony to another, from one state to another. And so the men who went to this convention were frantic. They were worried. They were anxious. We usually have these images of them as marching in tall and strong, and they knew just what they were going to do, and they were each and every one of them brilliant, and they were confident they were going to create the greatest nation in the world. But they had not read ahead in the textbook. They did not know what was going to happen, and they were really worried. What drove them to that convention was a patriotic fear that a country would not last as long as the war to create it had lasted. And this is probably, again, not the way we like to think about these heroic figures. But I think what does make them heroic is that frightened, anxious, and uncertain about what they were going to do, they went to that convention anyway. So, how many of you know anything about any of these delegates? That is, I always ask my students, who is at the convention? Because I'm sadistic and mean. And I get answers like John Adams. Well, John Adams was in England. Thomas Jefferson, he must have been there. No, he was in France. Samuel Adams, no, they didn't want him there. He was a rabble rouser, not a nation builder. One student who was definitely a little confused told me that Abigail Adams was there. And another student from way out of left field told me that Clara Barton attended the convention. I'm not sure where that one came from, but I'm really, really glad she didn't become a history major.
Well, we have Richard Henry Lee. Was Richard Henry Lee there?
Yeah, no.
No? Okay.
Clara Barton, not there.
Right, Madison and Washington.
Washington was critically important. Benjamin Franklin, absolutely. Washington didn't want to go. Washington was terribly worried about the convention, about the government, but he didn't think, as he said, the genius of the people were ready for a strong national government. So he said, I can't go. I've been sick. My mother's been sick. And he gets letters from John Jay and from others saying, you absolutely must be there. If you are not there, no one will consider this legitimate. And so rather reluctantly, he attends. They immediately elect him chair, which makes him very happy because then he doesn't have to talk in the convention. Benjamin Franklin was there. How many of these men were really brilliant? How many of them, if they took the SATs, were going to get, 800 in both math and English? How many of them would be members of Mensa? Oh, Gouverneur Morris, yes, my favorite. He was there. Amy, I would say maybe 5. 3 is an underestimate. Who were the geniuses at the convention? Benjamin Franklin, no question about it. A scientist who was esteemed in Europe, well known in America, a brilliant man. Alexander Hamilton, who I'm inclined to think is one of the most brilliant of the founding fathers. an extraordinary rags to riches story. A razor sharp mind, a steel trap mind. Gouverneur Morris. I have to tell you a little bit about Gouverneur Morris because he's absolutely my favorite character. Gouverneur Morris, one of the richest men in America. He was the heir to Morrisania, which stretched from New York through New Jersey. Spoke several languages, very sophisticated, very smart, and he was a man who loved women as often as he possibly could. He must have had the greatest pickup line in the world because he looked a little bit like a grouper. You know, the fish had big fat lips. He had a withered arm from pouring an accident where he poured boiling water on it. And he had a peg leg. And here was a man who wooed women right and left. He especially liked the wives of other men. He liked married women. When he came to the convention, the New England delegates were really quite shocked about him. And they spread a rumor at the convention that said that Gouverneur Morris had lost his leg leaping out of the boudoir window of his best friend's wife when the friend unexpectedly came home. But this wasn't true at all. He had lost his leg in a carriage accident when he was 13. But Gouverneur Morris loved this story, and he never denied it. He thought it was a wonderful story about him, and that tells you a lot about his character. He enjoyed life, and he was really extraordinarily bright. James Madison is probably the fourth member who I would say was brilliant, and I always tell my students, maybe you'd be willing to tell yours, that James Madison's greatest contribution to American society was that he invented the comb-over. If you look at the pictures of Madison, I think we have the...
Yeah, why don't we go to
Yeah.
those? See, there's Washington, Jefferson.
Wasn't there. And
there's
Madison, and you can see, even at age 30, he was balding. Madison was a hypochondriac. He was a little bit like my sister, who anytime she heard about a disease, leprosy, Carol, I have it. And Madison, of course, lived to a ripe old age. He was very high-strung. He went to Princeton, which was then called the College of New Jersey, and he had to quit because he had a sort of nervous breakdown. Then he tried to study law, and it made him too anxious. He had a very wealthy and tolerant father, so he never worked a day in his life, which is one reason why he could read all of those books in political philosophy. But he was a good tactician and a strategist. And I would say the fifth man at the convention who was genuinely brilliant was James Wilson, the jurist, who was very well respected by everybody there. And yet, Jefferson later on called them all demigods, and most people think of all of them as amazingly brilliant men. So why do you think that is? Why would their contemporaries admire them for their superior intelligence, and why have we come to think of them that way? Any thoughts?
Okay. They created something that never was created before. They had great ideas.
They hadn't created anything that had never been before when they came to the convention, and yet they had that reputation. So, and they did have good ideas. There's no question, oh no, they didn't create a democratic society. None of them were for democracy. I'll talk about that with you a little bit later. Let me explain about these men. They were members of the elite. They were better educated than anybody else. They had gone to college. Many of them had gone to law school. They had gone to law school in England in the Inns of Court. They could afford to own books, which were very expensive. They had huge libraries, many of them. And so they had a monopoly on knowledge, which is one of the things that made them seem so much smarter than everybody else. Also, they had vast political experience. These were men who came from families that believed because they were members of the elite that they had a right to govern. They also thought they had an obligation to govern. They saw it both as a right and a duty. But they grew up at a dinner table where their fathers and their uncles and their brothers and their cousins talked politics. And so they knew about political procedures. And most of them had been in the Continental Congress. They had been in the Articles of Confederation Congress. They had been governors of their states. They had been members of their state legislature. In fact, Edmund Randolph had been governor of the largest and most wealthiest state, Virginia, when he was 25 years old. They knew parliamentary procedure. They knew how to caucus. They knew how to make deals. They understood the practicalities of politics. They were really experienced politicians. And this made them, in many ways, head and shoulders above the farmers and the shopkeepers around them. So they come to the convention. They're nervous. They're anxious. They're absolutely uncertain if they can do anything. And what do? Someone wrote in the chat room, they created something new. What's new in the Constitution?
Well, shall we move ahead to some of the text that we have? You can do that clicking up there on the, there we go. Let's see, Franklin. That's not the question we're on right now. Let's see.
No.
While people are do we have a question for that? What's new? I think we do.
The amendment process. Is that what you're asking about, Amy?
Someone has put up the amendment process, right?
You know that the Massachusetts Constitution was written 3 different times, and they included an amendment process. Many of the states had a possibility of an amendment process. How about checks and balances? Is that new?
Okay, checks and balances new.
How many of you, what's really interesting about the Constitution is that these men knew not to do anything really new. They knew that if this was going to be accepted, they had to appeal to things that people thought of as natural, as normal. Oh yeah, checks and balances. Well, we know about that. And they did, because they came from an Anglo-American political culture that had had these things around for years. Think about the English Revolution. The English Revolution in the 17th century is all about the Parliament being able to check the king's power. The House of Lords and the House of Commons, bicameral government, as old as England's government. Independent judiciary, as old as England's government. Separation of powers, as old as the English government, as old as the colonial governments, as old as the state governments. If you looked at the constitutions of the states, you would see all of these factors there. Everything was there. So what's really new? What's the one great innovation of the Constitution?
Okay.
Anybody want to venture a guess?
Any takers on that? What's the one new thing the founders came up with? Popular sovereignty?
The state governments had that. Every state, almost every state constitution, and this is important to remember when you ask why there was no Bill of Rights, most of the state constitutions began with a statement that said our power comes from the people, and these are the things we can't do, and these are the things that we're allowed to do, and these powers lie with the people. So that was really not anything particularly new.
Okay, how about a Bill of Rights?
No, Bill of Rights. Every one of these state, in fact, when they considered a Bill of Rights at the very end of the convention, and they all really, really wanted to go home. They'd been there 4 months. They were sleeping 3 to a bed in taverns. They were eating tavern food. They couldn't call their families. They couldn't text them. They couldn't email. They wanted to go home. And someone said, "How about well, they didn't call it a Bill of Rights. They said, "How about a statement of the rights of the people?" And everybody groaned. And finally, someone said, "Wait a minute. We don't need to do that. We'll be here for a month debating that. We don't need to do it because the states have already done it." And it was a terrible strategic mistake, but that speaks to the fact that Bill of Rights were nothing new. But what's unusual about our government?
Okay, I have another suggestion. The federal system and the division of powers.
At the federalism is exactly the innovation of our government. It's the single real innovation of the Constitution. And I put up a, do we have the statement of what federalism is? Can I get to that?
Let's see. I think if we move back, Carol.
Oh, right. Oh, I'm sorry. You're right.
Yeah. If we go
back
to
and
the
run are hard for me, right?
left. Okay, keep going. Go through the rogues gallery here. There we.
No, that's
nope,
the Articles of Confederation.
Okay, why don't we go forward then?
Should be, yes, it should be in here. Oops, it's not. I'm not able to move.
Okay, let me see if I can find it. Let me file through. In the meantime, please go ahead.
Well, federalism says that sovereignty is divided. It's divided between two separate there it is.
There we go.
Power is divided between a central authority and political units. It's an idea that the Americans had proposed it to England right before the Declaration of Independence. In a last-ditch effort, the Continental Congress said, let's have two parliaments, one in America and one in England, and we'll all be loyal to the king. And the men in Parliament fell out of their chairs laughing. What a ridiculous idea. You can't divide sovereignty. But the Americans put that into their Constitution. Do you think it was because they were so smart or that this was such a wonderful idea?
Okay, why did they put that in there?
They put that in there because they didn't have a choice. The state governments already were sovereign. That's where the real power lay. And in order for the Constitution, the new national government, to have power, it was going to have to siphon power away from the states. It was going to have to share some powers with the states. They were quite reluctant to do this. Hamilton got up in the convention. Hamilton does not read politics well. He's brilliant at policy, and he gets up in the Constitutional Convention. He says, this business of federalism, it's just never going to work. You can't divide sovereignty. There'll be arguments over who has ultimate power. There's only one solution to this problem, he says. We have to abolish the states. And you can just picture everyone in the room saying, sit down, Alex, take your medicine. I mean, it was absolutely a ridiculous idea. You couldn't abolish the states. So they faced this unusual thing, federalism. And it's been the biggest problem of the national government ever since. Can you think of some moments in American history when federalism has been a problem?
Let's see. Any suggestions out there from our participants? When has federalism posed a problem for our country? Obamacare,
right.
Integration. Yeah, if any of you saw the Freedom Rider, Freedom Riders last night. Yeah, that
the Supreme Court said you have to integrate, and
Orville
Father said my state's not going to do that.
Yep. States' right
policy. Yes, the Civil War, that pesky little event called the Civil War, which was over exactly this issue. Anything else? You could probably do a timeline of American history based just on the problems of federalism. the Hartford Convention. The northern New England states were the first ones to threaten to secede. The nullification controversy, the Civil War, the integration of schools in Arkansas, right down until today, Obamacare, immigration policy. Who has the final say is a consistent problem in federalism. And that really is the only absolute innovation in our Constitution. I realize that that's sort of a surprise, but it really is the only one. And these men were smart. They created a government that looked just like what the average American voter of the time thought a government ought to look like. Why can't we all get along, states and federal government? I don't know the answer to that one.
Yeah, let me pose a question here.
Yeah.
Other than Alexander Hamilton's suggestion that we abolish the states, were there any other alternative plans put forth aside from the one that we ended up with?
Not on this issue. There were many alternative plans. They wanted to discuss a unicameral Congress, then a bicameral Congress. There was a great debate about how people would be chosen for the Congress. And this comes to another really central point about these men. The men who came to this convention were nationalists. They were self-selected, and they were unusual among political leaders. Most political leaders were localists. Most political leaders were believers that their state was the center of the universe. Patrick Henry, till the day he died, referred to his country, to Virginia, as his country. And so they were provincial. That is, their point of reference was their own province, their own state. These men were different. Their point of reference was creating a nation. And part of the reason that was the case was that these were men who had been born in another country. Many of them had been born in Ireland. Many of them had been born in England. They had studied abroad at the University of Edinburgh, at the Inns of Court, and they had all been officers, not all, but many of them, officers in the Continental Army, and traveled the length and breadth of the country. And so they were in many ways really unique in that they wanted a national government. And the big fight was whether the upper house of the government and the lower house of the government would be elected based on proportional representation. Madison wanted this so badly. Why? Because they didn't want the states as states to have any control of any branch of the government. And they lost that battle. The convention almost exploded. People were going to take their marbles and go home. And James Wilson comes to James Madison and puts his hand on his shoulder and he says, either you give in and you make the Senate the branch that represents the state's power, or this convention will be over. And so fights about that, discussions about how to elect the president. But nobody but Hamilton believed that you could abolish the states and just have a national government.
So the men who the founders were, you're saying that the perspective that informed the founders was one of cosmopolitanism. These
Yes.
people had been all around the world, all around the colonies at the time, and they were more sophisticated than the farmers and merchants back home.
And more sophisticated than many of their fellow politicians. I mean, Patrick Henry was a political leader. Samuel Adams was a political leader. Mercy Otis Warren was an educated, intelligent woman. But they cared more about their own state, about their own locality. And they were completely reasonable in that attitude. That is, I'm not suggesting when we say provincial, I'm not suggesting they were foolish or country hayseeds. Why would you, in the 18th century, why would you think of your state as your country? What was different about the 18th century from, say, today?
Okay, let's pose that to the participants. Why do you think most people in the colonies had this kind of provincial perspective? Why would they think that the borders of the world ended with the borders of their states pretty much? Obviously, one thing is that they didn't travel very much. The roads and waterways and travel was difficult. Economic reasons. Okay, anything else? It's where they worked, grew up, in their family. Yeah, people stayed put. They stayed put.
Given how hard
Limited
it is
communications.
airline travel today, we may all go back to that. Limited communication, absolutely. They didn't have computers. They didn't have telephones. They didn't have telegraphs. Most people knew the people within a 10-mile radius of where they lived. And so for them, the idea of, if you lived in Georgia, you knew more about what was happening in England because ship captains brought English news in English newspapers than you knew about what was going on in Pennsylvania. You didn't know you didn't know anybody from Massachusetts. And so it was reasonable. I don't want to say that these provincial people were, backward. They were reasonable in their belief that, especially in their belief that the people who ought to govern them ought to be people who earn their living the same way as they did and people who they knew. Some of us are still like that, absolutely. If you live in Manhattan, you think that it's Manhattan, and then you need a passport to go to any place else in the country, even Brooklyn. The most provincial people in America are people who live in Manhattan, where I live. So for them, this was a perfectly sensible approach. It was the men at the convention who were unusual. It was the men at the convention, and I think I have up, or I gave you Hamilton's letter. Hamilton saw America as potentially the most powerful country in the world. It would rival England. People thought he was nuts. I mean, people could not imagine that America would become this strong nation with a place at the table of the nations of Europe. Well, some people think he was nuts, and some of us think he had great vision. Hamilton is the only person at the convention who thought about the future. They were there to solve an immediate problem. They were there to save the country from falling apart. Hamilton wanted to introduce policies that would make the country economically competitive. Throughout the entire rest of the 18th century, it was Hamilton who thought that if you just pursued certain kinds of policies, within a generation we would rival England. But most of the men at the convention were really just thinking about, how can we keep Virginia and Maryland from killing each other? How can we keep England from taking us over again? How can we keep France from encroaching on us? How can we keep Spain from encroaching on us? There's one other innovation. I take it back. There's one other innovation in the Constitution. How about the See, I almost said it, Richard. The Electoral College, which when I was a kid I called the Electrical College. The Electoral College is a very odd thing. Any of you know how it works?
Okay, let me see if I can find that slide that we have, and then in the meantime, we have some comments. Would it be safe to say that these men were well suited to set forth the lofty ideals that created the foundations of our government, but not so suited for the smaller policies? What do you think about that?
Interesting question. The lofty ideals that they worked with were already there. That is, what's really wonderful about the American Revolution and the history of this era is the idea of popular sovereignty, the idea that the people are the sovereign, the idea that there must be checks and balances on the power of anyone. They were really there. I'm not so sure that they weren't suited for smaller policies. If you read Madison's notes, boy, these guys could argue over the tiniest issues. I think, though, Hamilton was the true genius about how to create public policies that would make for a strong nation. So yeah, Vicki, the Electoral College goes with how states vote. But why have it? Why not? Why not have the voters? And I don't want to say the people because the people couldn't vote, but the white men who owned property who were eligible to vote. What? Why didn't they just say, okay, let them elect the president? Elbridge Gerry, as you can see, said that it referred to the ignorance of the people. Do you think that that was really the uh, overriding reason?
Could that have been the overriding reason, the ignorance of the people? We just got through talking about how the founders were more cosmopolitan, sophisticated, and educated. Did they have this fear of ignorance? We have people responding to ensure that the educated ultimately chose the president. It would give those more important people on states a voice. And it seems to be people are tending toward the agreeing with Gary. Back to the slow communication. There we go.
Got the answer.
Amy wins.
An A for you, Amy. The problem was people who lived in Georgia didn't know anybody in Massachusetts. Everybody knew Washington was going to be the first president. There were only two men who everyone in America knew, Washington and who else? Who's the other person everyone knew?
Let's see. Franklin.
Absolutely.
There we go.
And Franklin, no, John Adams so wished that were true. John Adams so wanted to be known by everybody, but he really was not. And he worried about it all the time. He often wrote in his diary, I will turn to dust and go to the worms, but Franklin and Washington will be remembered. The problem was if they had a popular election, there would be 500 candidates. Jefferson was not known by everybody. In fact, you know that the Declaration of Independence, once it was written and issued, was totally forgotten about. What was important then was winning the war. And I would be willing to bet you that most people in America had no idea who wrote it. So here, you would have 500 candidates because everybody would vote for a local person they knew. And they pondered this at the convention in the beginning, and then they said, we don't know how to deal with this. And at the very end of the convention, it was the last issue they resolved. And ironically, they resolved it with a suggestion that James Wilson made the third day of the convention, and no one listened to him. The Electoral College is a fascinating thing. Here's what its members were going to be. Now, remember, there were no political parties. They thought political parties were terribly dangerous. So it wasn't like you could elect a slate of Republicans or a slate of Democrats. The state legislatures were going to appoint the members of the Electoral College from their state. They were to be people who had served in the national government but weren't serving anymore. And they were going to choose the president because they would know people. So when John Adams ran for president, someone in North Carolina could say, oh, yeah, the little short, fat dude from Massachusetts, I know him, he's okay. And that's why they created the Electoral College, to find a mechanism, a way to pick people who somebody would know. So do we need it today? I get asked this all the time. Do we need the Electoral College today? How many of you at the end of a presidential campaign don't know everything there is you ever wanted to know about someone running for president? And more than you ever wanted to know. But if you lived in the 18th century, were you going to get on your horse and start in Maine and ride door to door from farm to farm to introduce yourself to someone? It would have been impossible. It would have been unbelievable. So they create the Electoral College. Why?
So the argument that, excuse me, Carol, the argument that you hear today that we need the Electoral College to somehow protect the interests of the small states against the behemoths like you folks in New York, that's not true, actually.
Well, I only talk about dead people usually. I don't like to talk about modern day. I think the Electoral College is outmoded. But the problem, if you gave one person one vote, is that minorities in America would have more political clout. Because all those African Americans in cities and all those Hispanic Americans would, their votes would individually count more. And people who live in whiter states, I think, don't want that to happen. I don't mean all of them. I don't mean it all to cast aspersions on, but I think that one person, one vote gives too much power to non-majorities. But of course, one of the things that's going to happen is pretty soon those people who were minorities will be the majority. Why don't these people all meet in one place? Why was it explicitly said that the electors would meet in their state and then they would send their votes to Congress and Congress would count the votes? What does that, why would they do that?
Okay. Why would they do that? Any speculation?
Why can't they just all get together and cast their votes? It would be much easier.
Well, in the 18th century, the problem of travel, of course, would be would be difficult.
That's one, but that's less important to them than their great. Yes, absolutely, Kelly. They were fearful that a foreign power would bribe the men in the Electoral College to throw the election to someone who would turn the country over to England or turn it over to France. Or, worse than that, they were afraid that these men, yes, would make backroom bargains with one another and elect one of their members, and then they would become a ruling oligarchy. So what does this tell you? What are they most afraid of? And this is why I admire these men so much. What are they afraid of more than anything? What does that tell you? Especially this creation of an oligarchy. Why are they so obsessed with checking people's powers? Yes, they're afraid of themselves. These are men who have the decency to know that they are the people who are going to run the government, and they are afraid of themselves. They want to check their own power. I usually add here, too bad current politicians don't feel that way.
Carol, you said you just talk about dead people.
Yes, I know. But it is true that these are men of enormous political integrity, not necessarily sexual integrity, not necessarily business integrity. A couple of them are going to wind up running away from the sheriff because they've been involved in the 18th century version of Ponzi schemes or speculation. But in terms of politics, they had the good grace to fear themselves. And this runs through the entire convention. You can read Madison's notes on yale.edu, the Avalon Project. You can sit there and read them day by day. And what you will discover is that these men are obsessed with the idea that power corrupts. They know the government needs power. They know they're going to be the ones with the power, but they definitely want to restrict themselves. And I think that that's incredibly, incredibly admirable. I honestly do. My respect for them comes not from them being geniuses and not from them knowing what they were doing, but it comes from their willingness to say, I'm worried what I would do if I had absolute power. Yes,
Is it?
they tried to conceive of every possible conspiracy. You should hear them in the commandment they're talking about. It would make modern day conspiracy theory look weak. The Senate will have too much power. No, the small states will team up together in the House, and they'll overpower Virginia. I mean, they're really seriously concerned about this.
Carol, would you say this sense they had about restricting themselves is also kind of a cultural trait of the Enlightenment? I mean, the Enlightenment believed in limits. They were quite skeptical. These cosmopolitan founders were participating in that general culture, were they not?
Yes, yes, absolutely. I think you're absolutely right. But it's just so striking because here they had the possibility, because the country was in crisis. They had the possibility to make Washington a king. They had the possibility to make of themselves a kind of self-appointed oligarchy, and they really resisted that. They were really worried about this. At one point in the convention, Benjamin Franklin looks directly at Washington, who everybody admired, and he has James Wilson read his speech because Franklin's very ill. And in his speech, he says, no man among us can resist the siren call of power. I mean, that's a pretty self-aware comment about the dangers of power. Really, everybody knew exactly what he meant, not even Washington. And you see the quote from John Adams to Thomas Jefferson. It's such a funny exchange because Thomas Jefferson is in Paris, and he is completely opposed to the Constitution. He writes a 20-page attack on the Constitution, and he mails it to everybody he knows in America. James Madison finally writes to him and says, would you stop attacking the Constitution? Would you be quiet? And his biggest concern is that Washington will become a monarch. He wants the president elected every single year. He wants rotation in office every single year. Of course, when Jefferson becomes president, 8 years is fine. But when he's not in power, he says, so he writes to Adams about this, and Adams writes back completely bluntly. He says, you're afraid of the one. I'm afraid of the few. You're apprehensive of monarchy, but I'm afraid of aristocracy. You're apprehensive of the president when once chosen will be chosen again and again as long as he lives. So much the better, as it appears to me. As often as elections happen, the danger of foreign influence recurs. Though Adams is really worried that France or England or Spain will move in and do something hinky and take over our government. Two very different views.
Karen, let me ask, how much of a real threat was that? Were we really being threatened by Spain and England and France?
On the eve of the convention meeting, the French ambassador to America sends a letter home and he says, what part of the United States would you like us to take when it falls apart? So I think it's more likely that foreign countries were sitting waiting for Americans to kill one another. They were sitting and waiting for Virginia to fire on Maryland. And in fact, on the eve of the Revolution, on the eve of the Constitution, Connecticut and New Jersey were rumored to be meeting in secret to plan an attack on New York. That's how angry they were at the men who ran the port of New York, who were charging them exorbitant prices. And we who live in Manhattan believe that plot is still alive. Every single weekend, people come in from New Jersey and Connecticut and take all our parking places. But in fact, the danger really fell to them picking states off as the states quarreled with one another and went to war with one another. And Adams is really, it's so hard to get students to realize that we were not a powerful place, and we felt threatened from every side. Indians were attacking on the frontier, and our entire army had 500 men. We had no Navy. It was a frightening time to be a leader in America. Yeah, the XYZ affair. I mean, basically, France said, we won't even talk to you unless you bribe us. So I think that when I teach, I try to get my students to understand what it felt like to be the little guy on the block, what it felt like to be the country that people were certain was just going to disappear soon, that we were not the #1 country in the world. And I think that's real hard for students to grasp. They're so used to the idea that we are the biggest, most important country on the planet. So they're terribly afraid of power. They give themselves power, and then they're afraid that the Constitution won't be approved. Many of them are really worried about it. Now, I want to go back, if I can, to this question about democracy. The men who were at the convention thought that voting was a privilege. It wasn't the right of anybody who was born here. You were allowed to vote if you had a stake in society, which of course my students write STEAK, and I write in the margin porterhouse or T-bone. They really meant you had to have something to lose. And by that they meant property, real property, land. That was really what wealth was. You had to have something to lose before you could make decisions about what the laws would be. You had to be male, you had to be white, but you had to be a property owner. Anybody else would make, as they were fond of saying, outrageous and ridiculous laws. One of them would be, you have more property than I do. I want some of it. Give it to me. I'm going to pass a law that says you're going to give it to me. So they were not for democracy. They were creating a republic, a representative government. But who it represented was not, or who would partake in it was not everybody. They said there are 3 great threats to a republic. Tyranny of the one, a tyrant. Tyranny of the few, an oligarchy. And the greatest threat of all, tyranny of the many, or democracy. And that's why Madison is so concerned about majority and minority rights. He doesn't mean minorities, gay people or two-headed people or women. He means the wealthy. He means the minority who own the most property. They're very concerned about that. We can't make them 21st century men. It's just wrong. They're 18th century men. They believe you have to have a stake in society to have a voice in society. And what had just happened in 1787 that scared the living daylights out of them, that brought this fear to mind? Anybody remember what happens in Massachusetts? Oh yeah, rebellion. Shays' Rebellion that spread from Massachusetts to many other of the states. And as far as men like John Adams were concerned, this was the rabble rising up to take over from men of property. So they're not Democrats. Probably the only person who really was Samuel Adams. And even he wanted to see Shays' rebels hanged. So you can't turn them into people who have our views of the world. They lived in a very hierarchical world. Husbands could beat wives. Husbands and wives could beat children. Everybody could beat servants and slaves. Masters could beat apprentices. I mean, literally, it was a hierarchical world. And it takes a long time for the idea of democracy to evolve in America. It really does. I tell my students that's one of the great engines of American history, the fight to make political participation a birthright, of everybody who was born in America. Takes really until after the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. So what else? Is there anything else that surprises you about what these men did, or that you think that these men might have done, uh, uh, that you've heard that they did, that I might be able to? Were they all concerned with? Were they at all concerned with the plight of the poor? Someone wants to know. Not especially. I mean, they may have been personally concerned. There were several of them who were opposed to slavery, who thought that it was morally wrong. They didn't think the convention should do anything about that. Uh, their whole purpose was to save the country. They had an agenda. We have to create a national government that could tax, that could regulate trade, that could have an army and a navy, that could protect our borders. So they didn't have time to, they didn't have on their agenda to think about some of the things that we think are really important. Social issues. They're not talking about social issues. They're not talking about education. They're not talking about poverty. They're not talking about women's rights. They're not really, those things aren't on their agenda. Their plate, they think, is really pretty full with saving the country.
We have a speculative question here from Amy Henson. Would the Constitution be any different if Jefferson had been there? Could you speculate on that for a little, Carol?
Jefferson, I think, would not have gone to the convention. He really was tremendously opposed to this creation. He thought the Articles of Confederation were just fine. And remember, he's a Virginian. Even Madison, once the government is in place, begins to be a states' rightist. No, I don't really think the national government should tell Virginia what to do. So he's a Virginian first and foremost. He also, if I can, he was in France. And in France, politics was really dirty. And there were cabals and secret meetings, and he couldn't figure out what was going on, and there was corruption and licentiousness. And he was really worried that an American national government would turn into something like the French government. So I don't think he would have gone, and I think if he had gone, he would have been absolutely horrified by everything that they were doing. It certainly would have been different if he had had authority at the convention. He would have said, we're only here to propose amendments to the Articles of Confederation, and that's all we should do. He would not have let them write, if he could have prevented it, let them write another constitution. So, Amy, I don't think that's a possibility.
Okay. Carol, we posed a question. I think we don't think we've quite gotten to it, about the secret. Why did they meet in secret?
Yes, this is another. The way I learned it when I was a kid was they met in secret because they didn't want the world to know how bad things were. The world knew how bad things were. Everybody knew how bad things were. It was no secret what was going on. So that's not really why. They didn't meet in secret so that they could talk more openly to one another. Exactly. They met in secret because they didn't know if they were going to produce a constitution. They didn't know if it was going to be accepted by the people of America. And if it weren't, they were going to go back to their state governments and continue their political careers in their state governments. Well, when they got to the convention, they knew almost immediately that if they were going to produce a constitution, they would have to compromise. That is, they would have to give up on some things that their state governments had told them, don't give in on this. They all received instructions, and the instruction says, don't do this, don't do that, don't give up our power to do this, don't give up. And as soon as they got there, they started compromising. And they didn't want people back home to know that. Because if things didn't work out, I told you they were great politicians. If things didn't work out, they didn't want to go home and have people say, "You sell out. You tried to sell Maryland out. You traitor. You tried to sell Massachusetts out." They were so concerned about this that this is what they did every day. I didn't know parliamentary procedure. Someone had to explain this to me. Every day they adjourned to be a committee of the whole. And I thought, what does that mean? The whole convention is going to be a committee. And then someone explained to me, votes taken in a committee do not have to be recorded officially. So they would wheel and deal, and they would compromise, and they would argue, and they would take a vote, and then take another vote, and then take another vote, and try to convince one another of something. And when they finally agreed, they would reconvene as the convention, and then they would take a formal vote from the delegates of every state. And that's the only thing that appeared in the official records of the Constitutional Convention. I mean, these men are really smart. They really know how to protect themselves. And that's why they met in secret. That's why they became a committee of the whole every day. And that's why they never talked about what they were doing to anybody during the whole 4 months. You've got to read Jefferson's letters to, Madison's letters to Jefferson and to his father. Madison is ready to explode. Every letter begins, "We've done something really important today, but I can't tell you what it was. We've done something really great today, but I can't tell you what it is." And finally, his father writes him a letter and says, "Jimmy, we know you can't tell us, so you don't have to apologize." So even Madison, who really was a big blabbermouth, even Madison never breathes a word of what's going on. They were protecting their own political power. And, you can't fault them for that. So that's why all the secrecy.
So, does this what are the implications of all this secrecy for folks today who talk about original intent? Is that can we really get at original intent, given the fact that the veil of secrecy has been pulled down rather tightly?
Well, Madison's notes were finally published, and he reveals everything that happened.
Mm-hmm.
But I think we need to ask it slightly differently. These men never intended that the document they wrote was written in stone. When they're done, Benjamin Franklin says, if this Constitution lasts 10 years, we will have done our duty. What they do, and the title of my book is A Brilliant Solution, and what I mean by that is the amendment process. They believed that future generations would have completely different circumstances. They didn't know what they were. They couldn't read the future. But they knew there would be other issues, other problems that they couldn't envision. And so they said there should be an amendment process so this Constitution can be changed by the next generations. And so to talk about original intent is to do a disservice to what these men intended, which was that the Constitution should be a living, breathing, changing document that accommodated what people needed 5 generations later. And it's always interesting to me that we're obsessed with trying to figure out what Madison meant, as if we have smog in Los Angeles, and so let's go back and see what Madison would have said about that. Or we have nuclear dangers, so let's see what the Founding Fathers said about that. It really, I would say their original intent was that there was no original intent, is really what I'm trying to say. I think they saw this as a framework. They certainly didn't want people to change everything in it on a whim, but they really were open to change, and that's why they had that amendment process in there.
We have a question to go back to our discussion of Jefferson earlier. John Timmerman writes, didn't Jefferson also want emancipation for blacks, but chose to let his feelings take a back burner so as to be able to address other things he felt were important too? Do you think African Americans, the enslaved, would have fared differently had Jefferson been there?
No.
No.
You know, most of what Jefferson says about slavery, he says privately.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't say to the world. Jefferson's a very complicated man, and I have to say up front, not my favorite figure from that era. I really, as Laura can tell you, I'm a Hamiltonian kind of person. I think I think that to give Jefferson, he's a complex person, and I think that slavery bothered him, but he did not know a way out of it, and so he left it in effect to the future. He left it to somebody else to solve that problem. The reason they extend well, I'll ask, why do they extend the slave trade? Why does South Carolina say this is a deal breaker? If you don't extend the slave trade for several years, we'll fold up our chairs and go home. What would lead to that?
What would lead to that? Why would South Carolina demand an extension of the slave trade? Any takers on that question? Clearly, the South Carolina economy depended on it. Well, there's money to give them time to home grow their own slaves and get more power in Congress.
Well, that's a piece of it. But remember, the American Revolution is fought largely in the South.
Mm-hmm.
There were two major campaigns in the South. Once Lexington and Concord and Bunker Hill are done, the war moves out of New England. After the British leave Philadelphia, it's true they hold New York through the whole revolution, but after Burgoyne, the war is basically over there. But there are two major campaigns. And what do the British do? Abraham Lincoln took a page out of their book when he issued the Emancipation Proclamation. The British generals issue declarations, proclamations that say any slave who leaves the plantation and joins the British Army camp will be free. So they want to disrupt the Southern economy. And so many slaves run away, die in the British camps because they're underfed and underclothed, or leave when the British leave, when there's an evacuation, that South Carolina and Georgia are absolutely bereft of slaves. They can't restore their plantation economy. In Georgia, they had 500 slaves left in the whole state. And so they want to extend the slave trade so they can restock, basically. I mean, to put it bluntly, they want to be able to restock their slave population. Virginia, on the other hand, is moving away from tobacco and toward growing wheat. And they want to dump their slaves in South Carolina. They want to sell their slaves to South Carolina. So many of the Virginians didn't want to extend the slave trade. But it wasn't out of decency, if you will. It wasn't out of high-minded moral position. It was because they were hoping to sell their slaves down to Georgia and hoping to sell their slaves down to the Carolinas. So there's not a lot of moral debate about slavery. They're 18th century men. Slavery seemed a perfectly reasonable labor system to them.
Okay. We have a question from Amy Hansen. What are your suggestions on how to flesh out the characters of the delegates to students? Good question.
Yeah. Well, it depends on what grade you're teaching. I don't think you can tell them about Gouverneur Morris if you're teaching elementary school. I don't know. Maybe you have hipper kids than the ones I know.
Well, they might enjoy hearing about his wooden leg, but beyond that, I'm not so sure.
I don't think you better tell them. I think that
middle school, Amy asks.
Middle school? Well, Amy, it's your judgment. But I think that what you want to get across, if I can sort of be like mother here. I think what you want to get across is that they were men. They weren't demigods. They weren't Charlton Heston handing down the Ten Commandments. They were men. They had good points. They had bad points. They were stutterers. They were overweight. Some of them were liars. They were speculators. They were sleeping with their slaves. They were haughty. Some of them were really quite snobbish. Some of them were not. They were a mix of human beings. What is, I think, again, incredibly admirable about them is they did not come to the convention as ideologues. They came knowing that they would have to compromise. Not just the Great Compromise, not just the Three-Fifths Compromise. If you read those Madison notes, they compromised every single day. And at the end, Hamilton says, no man got everything he wanted. No man got nothing he wanted. And every man got something he wanted. Again, this is just my view, but you watch C-SPAN today, would that we had a government right now with people willing to compromise for the good of the country instead of being dug-in ideologues. And these men really were patriots. That is, they put the need of the country first. And I think if you make them human beings, then the kids can admire them in a real way, not like Superman, not like Batman, but like people who really cared about what would happen to the country. And so that's the kind of thing I would want to convey to students, that they were just like the students. If the students think that the men who wrote the Constitution were demigods, then they think, gee, we could never do that. We can't do that. But if you tell them they're just people and they rose to the occasion, then it sort of puts the obligation on us to rise to the occasion too. And that seems to me to be a very important thing to do. And no, I am not running for office with that speech, but I think it's really important that they see them as people.
Carol, you'd mentioned just briefly a minute ago the Three-Fifths Compromise. I don't think we discussed that here. Could you just review that for us real quickly?
Yes. Again, nothing new. In the Articles of Confederation government, when they were going to ask each state to contribute to the sustenance of the national government, we all know how well that worked out. In trying to figure out how much each state was supposed to give, the northern states were very upset because they said if you only count the white population in the southern states, then those people won't have to give very much money, and we'll all have to give a lot of money. So they said, we have to work out some way to count the slaves. So in the original Three-Fifths Compromise, it was the North that wanted it because they wanted the requisitions that the South had to pay to be bigger. Then we get to the convention, and the issue is representation in the House. And they come up with the same figure, a Three-Fifths Compromise. But this time the South is fighting for it, and the North is opposed to it, because the South wants more representatives in the House of Representatives, and the North wants to keep the Southern representatives smaller. So it's the same compromise, it's just everybody switches sides. And it tells you, it foreshadows, if you will, what's going to come in 1860. That is, it tells you that sectional divisions, which people weren't yet really conscious, they weren't articulating, crop up in things like the Three-Fifths Compromise. And my students all think it means that every black person was 3/5 of a person. But, of course, it means that every 5 slaves were counted as 3 people for the purposes of representation.
Okay. All right. Let's see. Here we have another question. Can you talk about your experiences researching for a brilliant solution? What sparked your interest in the subject?
Well, what sparked my interest, and I think I say this I've been teaching it for years. I mean, this is my period in history. I like politics. I had worked on the J papers, editing the J papers. I'd worked on the Hamilton papers. I knew a lot of these men, not personally. I'm not that old, but I knew a lot of these men well. I was interested in them. But the thing that sparked my writing about it was 9/11 and the presidential election, the Bush-Gore election. What struck me as even with the destruction in 9/11, nobody said, "Oh my God, that's the end of the country." In fact, we responded by saying, "We're still strong, we're still powerful, we're still America." And I thought, how different it must have seemed to the men who wrote the Constitution, who thought, we're weak, we're small, and we may not survive. And I thought, that was a much bigger crisis. I am not at all belittling the tragedy of 9/11, but that was not the greatest national crisis we've ever had. And then the Gore-Bush election, where all anybody talked about was who's going to be the president. That was the most important thing. Nobody said who won for your local congressman. It was who's going to be the president. And I thought, in the 18th century and in much of the 19th century, who was going to be the president didn't matter to anybody. It was not the most powerful office. It was powerful when Lincoln was president because it was the middle of a war. But most of the time, the president didn't really matter that much. And so I started thinking about how much that has changed since World War II, when, as Arthur Schlesinger says, we created the imperial presidency. That is, they didn't expect Washington to tell Congress what laws he wanted passed. They expected Congress to run the country. After all, that's Article 1, Congress. And then Washington would go do what they told him to do. He was the administrator. He was not the governor. They would pass laws, and he would say, okay, I'll see what I can do. I'll try to get this enforced. But now we have presidents who go to Congress and say, these are the bills we want you to pass. And so I was so struck by how much things had changed and how little people realized that I decided I wanted to write a book about it. That's often what spurs historians to sit down and write, is they look at something going on today and they go, wow, people just don't know what it was like back then. And then we begin to write our books. And I have to tell you, one of the ways I knew people didn't know was I did a lot of CNN shows and a lot of MSNBC shows and a lot of radio shows. And the commentators asked ridiculous questions that made it clear that they had no idea what had happened at the Constitutional Convention. And so I thought, I want to write this book. And I did. I did. My children ate Chinese food from takeout for many months, and while I wrote this book.
So your children paid the price for your scholarship, huh?
That's why they're thanked in every book. They're grown now, and they can order in their own Chinese food in their house, but they really did spend a lot of time eating takeout and order in because I was hammering away at my computer. But I will also tell you, research is much easier these days. You all have put up so many documents on the web. Yale put up all these documents on the web. Historical societies and archives are digitizing their documents and putting them up on the web. you can pretty much do major research with a glass of Merlot in your hand. You can sit in your own apartment or your own house, and it's such an extraordinary boon to historians. It really is. We don't have to go sit in archives as much as we used to.
Well, the conclusions you'd reach with that glass of Merlot in your hand might make for some very interesting history.
Okay, let me stay completely sober when I'm
Let me just scroll through we're coming to the end of our time here, Carol. Let me just scroll through the questions to make sure that we have addressed them all here. This one is about the attitude toward the convention, the fear and anxiety. Federalism, let's see, voting for the president, foreign influence. You mentioned why the convention didn't include a Bill of Rights. You said the folks were tired. Do you want to elaborate on that at all?
And they said, we'll be here another month because we'll come up with 500. And in fact, it turns out to be true. When Madison finally does write a Bill of Rights, put it together, he gets over 100 suggestions of what ought to be. That's why there are all those semicolons in the Bill of Rights. He tries to cram as many that are the same into categories together. And then someone says, it's not necessary because all rights not expressly given to the national government belong to the states, and the states all have bills of rights. And everybody goes, hip, hip, hooray. They pack their bags and they go home. It wasn't that they didn't believe in the rights of people. It's that they made a terrible strategic or tactical error because this was the strongest case that the anti-federalists had against ratifying the convention. They said you did not include a Bill of Rights. And the Federalists realized what a mistake they had made. And in the Massachusetts Convention, Rufus King says, let's ratify the Constitution on the condition that they add a Bill of Rights. And from then on, that's what all of the states did. They said on the condition that a Bill of Rights is added, and it saved the Constitution. So this was their one great lapse. And I do want to close with a word about Gouverneur Morris. Gouverneur Morris wrote the Constitution. When they had passed everything that they wanted to pass, it was a big mess, and they handed it over to him. And he made Article 1, Article 2, Article 3, and he wrote the preamble. The preamble they originally had was we, the delegates from New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut, to go down the coast. And Gouverneur Morris said, we've got to sell this thing to people, or words to that effect. And he writes the preamble that says all the wonderful things the Constitution's going to do. So he's really the father of the Constitution. I want to put in a plug for him.
Okay. Carol, you've mentioned, we have a question here about sources. You've mentioned the Yale, the Avalon Project as a source for some documents. I can say that our toolbox, Making the Revolution, is one. Mm-hmm. Any other archives that might be easily accessible and useful for our teachers that you'd like to mention?
You can definitely go online to the Washington papers, the Hamilton papers, the Jefferson papers, the John Adams papers, and they have digitized and put up scores of their letters about this. You can also go to collections. They're beginning to collect the debates in the ratifying conventions. Many of them are online. So that there's just a wealth of this material, and they're published. You know, the Hamilton papers are published. Many of Jefferson's papers are published. But the first place I would go is online to find their letters, to find their views about the convention, to find their speeches. You can read the Federalist papers online. They're on the Avalon Project. So I think that thank God for the computer and for digitizing things. I think this material is there for you anytime you want to look for it.
Okay. Well, we've come to the end of our time. Let me ask if there are any other questions that folks may have or any comments. Let me remind you that you will find the PowerPoint and a recording of this session on the website that you use to get your text. There is a forum for this seminar, and if you have access to that through the seminar website, and you can continue the discussion there. You can share comments and questions. We'll monitor the forum until the 27th of this month, and we'll get back to you with any comments, any responses that seem appropriate. Otherwise, folks, let me remind you to submit your evaluations. I want to thank Carol for giving us a wonderful seminar this evening.
Thank you.
And I want to thank all of our participants for your intelligent and active participation. This is your last seminar for this year. We'll get back together again in the fall for another round. So let me say, have a good summer. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and good evening.